That's a daily thing.
Yeah. You're back here with me.
Alright guys, thank you again so much. Alright, you're welcome to stick around, but we don't take our first break until 9:50.
We have a team meeting.
I got you. Awesome. Thank you guys so much. Sure.
Good luck, everybody.
Good luck. Thank you. Thank you again for breakfast. That's awesome. Alright folks, y'all welcome back. Everybody feeling good this morning? I see folks still taking advantage of the buffet and go to the second round, and that's great. That said, well, as much as you need caffeine and calories, we kind of have to leave, the bus kind of has to leave the station. And believe me, for today, you need caffeine and calories. When last we left our heroes, we were talking about the fun and exciting world of the offer to purchase and contract, which is, in my opinion, the perfect name for the document. You'll hear it referred to as the offer to purchase and contract. You'll hear it referred to as the OTP. Because we like acronyms and they make us feel smart, you'll hear some agents just refer to it as standard form 2T. The fact of the matter is, the offer to purchase and contract is the perfect name for a document, in my opinion. Because the offer to purchase and contract, it's actually one document that's a transformer. Y'all know what the transformer is? It's when the Autobots wage their battle to destroy the evil forces of the Decepticons. Transformer? Exactly. And it is more than meets the eye, buried in those 13 pages of little tiny writing. Because it serves two completely different legal purposes. This is why, in my opinion, it's the perfect name for the document. It is the offer to purchase real property and contract to purchase real property. When last we left our heroes, we were discussing what I think personally is probably the single most important point of the 75 hours we're going to spend together. If there was one concept that you just must really understand that will help you and serve you well, it's this one. The offer to purchase and contract serves two completely different roles. It is an offer to purchase, nothing more than a communication document. And at some point, it transforms. Certain things happen that make it the contract to purchase. And it becomes a bilateral contract. Somebody remind me, by the way, what does bilateral mean? Mutually binding on both parts. So we're going to start this morning, and we're going to start this morning by solving the mysterious question of when exactly that offer to purchase transforms into the contract to purchase. Does anybody remember, pardon me for a second, because I have my stuff down. We were beginning to talk about the difference between due diligence fee and earnest money deposit on page 231. Two aspects of the offer to purchase and contract. Who can tell me, raise your hand, if you can tell me essentially, it doesn't have to be word for word, essentially the difference between the due diligence fee and the earnest money deposit. Raise your hand if you can. Yes, sir.
Refundable and non-refundable.
Essentially, more or less refundable or non-refundable. Give them a round of applause. All right. Now, are there certain circumstances, small set of circumstances, where the due diligence fee is refundable? Yes, technically. But it is my opinion that you should set the expectation with your buyers that they're not going to see the due diligence fee back unless they go through with the property. On page 231, when last we left our heroes, on page 231, we were talking about the North Carolina Offer to Purchase and Contract, the North Carolina Association of Realtors, the North Carolina Bar Association Offer to Purchase and Contract. Again, if you hear people say OTP or Form 2T, it's all the same document. On the North Carolina Association of Realtors, North Carolina Bar Association Offer to Purchase and Contract, we have this thing called the due diligence period, which is designed for the buyers to do all those things that could have been handled in a contingency. Again, are contingencies legal in North Carolina?
Yeah.
Yes, they are. However, are there any contingencies in the standard contract?
No.
Oh, nay, nay. So, what do you do if a client wants to add a contingency? Is there a form for that?
Yes.
Yeah, there's always a form for that, right? Now, where we left off, and I'm backing up a little bit, where we left off with our heroes was talking about that due diligence fee. And as Mark was so kind to explain to us earlier, the due diligence fee is a fee, not a deposit. It's a fee that goes directly to the seller, essentially to take the home off the market while the buyer's conducting their due diligence, their informed investigation that we talked about last time. Essentially, with the one small exception of if the seller breaches, the buyer is only going to see that money back if they go through with the deal. If they go through with the transaction, then they will be given credit for having already paid that. That's very different conceptually than the earnest money deposit, which is a true traditional deposit like we like to think about. And by the way, the earnest money deposit, unlike the due diligence fee, has to go into a trust account. The due diligence deposit has to go into a trust account. And don't be intimidated by the term escrow agent. You'll see the term on the contract, escrow agent. That's just a legal term for whoever's holding the earnest money deposit. They hold it in a trust account, or what's called holding it in escrow. Trust accounts can be with the listing firm. The earnest money deposit can be held with a listing firm. The earnest money deposit can be held with the buyer's firm. Or the earnest money deposit can be held in an attorney's office. Doesn't matter. Quite frankly, we're going to learn that there are very specific rules that have to be followed with managing that money. So, by contract, by the standard offer to purchase and contract, there's literally a blank line. It says the earnest money deposit will be held by blank. And then it's got in parentheses, escrow agent. And somebody tell me, what does escrow agent mean? Anybody? Who's holding earnest money deposit? Sure. Now, where does the due diligence money go, by the way? Directly to the seller. Directly to the seller. Now, again, so to kind of keep it straight in your head, that due diligence fee is a fee that goes directly to the seller, and it needs to be given to the seller within 3 business days of contract execution. What that means is it needs to be given to the seller within 3 business days of us transforming from the offer to purchase and contract to the contract to purchase. But we still don't know what causes that transformation, do we? So doesn't it sound like it's pretty important, again, for us to understand exactly what causes that transformation? You're going to learn that there's a ton of stuff tied to when exactly that offer to purchase transforms into the contract to purchase. And I mean a lot of stuff tied to when exactly that date happens. So we're going to spend a little bit of time this morning talking about when exactly that date happens. But the earnest money deposit, however, goes into a trust account. And this is one of the few times that you as a PB have a little bit different rules than a full broker. There really is only a very few times. But make sure you know this. We might see this again. I try to give you subtle indicators of the important points. I was watching Dancing with the Stars last night. Some of you actually have your look in your face like, well, that's not a real dance movie. I know. But this is one of the few ways that you as a PB, provisional broker, have different rules than a full broker. The rule says, if you get earnest money deposit that's going to be held by your brokerage as the escrow agent, you must deliver it to your bank immediately. You must deliver it to your bank immediately. And the Real Estate Commission, what do y'all think they mean by immediately? Immediately. Right now. Yeah, immediately means right now. Okay? We're going to learn in a little while that there's a thing called the Delivery of Instruments Rule. And you're going to learn in a little while that the Delivery of Instruments Rule, for the moment, says that Any contract, any paper documents must be delivered immediately, but never more than 5 days, okay? Which is kind of a stretch, immediately, but never more than 5 days. It's kind of a long, right? So, when it comes to giving the earnest money deposit to your BIC, though, by immediately, they mean immediately, but never later than right now. They mean immediately. And this is one of the reasons why, quite frankly, when you're talking to a broker in charge, you should make sure that you have a broker in charge that's going to be available to you. Because when you call that broker in charge at 7:30 at night on a Thursday, and you've got that earnest money deposit, when does the Real Estate Commission say you have to give that earnest money deposit? Immediately. And if that BIC calls you and says, oh, well, I'm going out of town, go ahead and just hang on to it until Monday. Oh, nay. You must deliver it immediately. And it's the BIC's job to get it into the trust account. And the BIC has to get it into the trust account within 3 banking days of receipt. Now, this is not my first rodeo. You're going to want to get really into, is it banking or business or calendar, or banking or business or calendar? I promise you, you're going to want to do that, okay? So, let me go ahead and get that out of the way. Let me go ahead and just explain this to you. Look, yes, I have a whiteboard today. Look, by the way, everybody give a round of applause for the wonders of modern technology. Yes, this is a new thing invented. It's called a whiteboard. I can write on it and then erase it, and there is no chalk. Ooh. So, here's the deal, guys. A business day. These are awesome markers. This is Monday through Friday. Oh, excuse me. This is why I shouldn't be given new technology. I misspoke, and I apologize. Pardon me while I break out my brand new eraser. Eraser, say, ooh. A business day. A business day is actually established by the federal government as Monday through Saturday. I apologize. A business day is actually Monday through Saturday. A banking day is actually Monday through Friday. And a calendar day. And invariably, if I stop here, somebody says, but when's a calendar day? It's a calendar day, all day, 7 days a week, right? So, be aware, however, there are very few times, very few times, that they're going to ask you to know if something is a business day or a banking day. There may be times that you have to know business day, banking day, or calendar day. But it's easy, because these two are pretty similar, aren't they? Right? So they're not going to do that to you. They're not going to let you mess up on whether it's business day or banking day. But you might have to know if it's business day or calendar day, or banking day or calendar day. Does that make sense? In fact, let me say this. The test, just like in the real world, works exactly the same. Look at the scenario, avoid the distractors. What are they asking me, and what do I know? There will be times when it will look like a question where you're supposed to remember if it's business or banking day, but maybe it's not really about that. Maybe it's about things like, does anybody remember when we talked about timeshares, how many days right of rescission you have? 5. So it might give you the choice between 5 calendar days or 7 business days. And you're like, oh, is it business or, it's not really about, it's about 5 or 7. It's not about business or banking. Does that make some sense? Just be aware of that. Now, again, that's what it is, because I don't want that burning curiosity to keep you awake at night, but really, truly not as important as you would think it would be. Now, in order to have a rule, we have to have an exception to a rule, right? So speaking of number of days, how many days did I say your BIC has to get it in the bank? 3. Your BIC is 3 days to get it in the bank. If it's a check. This is why a lot of firms have a policy that they won't accept cash earnest money deposits. The BIC actually is 3 days to get it in the bank if it's a check. But if it's a cash, they have if it's cash, they have to get it in the bank immediately. And also, one of the other reasons is cash is kind of hard to follow. And the third reason is it's kind of some liability. You don't need to be driving around with $5,000 in cash in your trunk, right? And if you are, please see me. You're welcome to buy me lunch. Now, again, it's cash that they just deposit immediately. One of the things that's fascinating is if it's cash, it's going to clear the bank, probably, right? I say probably because there's counterfeit, sure. If it's cash, it's probably going to clear the bank. But if it's a check, it may not. And it happens that clients will bounce an earnest money deposit check. And it happens that clients will bounce a due diligence fee check. And unlike cash, which can be tendered to just about anybody, if a check bounces, they have 1 banking day per contract to remedy that. If a buyer, potential buyer, gives a bad check or the check bounces or they have 1 banking day to remedy that, and by remedy that I mean give verifiable good funds. Now, in Jim's fun and exciting world of Iron, let's put some dots together. Somebody remind me. We talked about sole liquidated damages, yes? Do you remember that? We talked about that the seller only has 1 remedy if the buyer is in breach. Somebody remind me, what is the sole liquidated damages that the seller has if the buyer is in breach? Yes, ma'am? Earnest money. Jill says, keeping the earnest money deposit. Give her a round of applause. Hey, thank you, Jill. You're 100% correct. So, here's some irony of this. For test purposes, and legally and truthfully, the buyer has 1 banking day to remedy insufficient funds. In practicality, in practice, as Jill just told us, if they can't remedy those insufficient funds, they're in breach. Which means the buyer gets to keep the earnest money deposit. That was a bad check. That started the problem. Y'all see the irony in that? Now, more importantly, what happens is because the buyer is in breach, the contract is now voidable by the seller. Really, more important than the fact that they get to keep the fake check is the fact that the seller can now back out of the contract if they choose to, because the buyer is in breach. Now, so again, to try to keep this straight in your head, the due diligence fee, unlike the earnest money deposit, does not go to the trust account. It goes right to the seller. Seller can spend it, go to Walmart, go to Golden Corral, whatever they want to do, right? But the buyer will get credit for having paid it when they go through the transaction. If they back out of the transaction, if the buyer backs out of the transaction, and they have the right to do that during the due diligence period. If the buyer backs out of the transaction, they do not get the due diligence fee back. That's why we call it a fee, not a deposit. They're not going to see that money again. It's one of the reasons why there's some strategery. I can use that word short. There's some strategery involved in picking, I love that word, in picking how much due diligence money to put down. So again, can the buyer back out during the due diligence period? Yes. For why? Any reason or no reason, right? Is there a form for that? Yes. And the form for that is called FYI, is the notification of buyer due diligence. It doesn't even give a reason. You don't even know that for the test, but it helps the concept. It doesn't even say why. It just says the buyer is exercising their right during the due diligence period to cancel the contract. But if they do that, they ain't getting the due diligence money back. They're not. The earnest money deposit, on the other hand, what happens with it depends on when exactly they cancel. See, I love this class because we start tying some stuff together. The due diligence, the earnest money deposit is supposed to be returned to the buyer. The buyer is entitled to it if they cancel First of all, if they cancel prior to acceptance, why is that? Somebody tell me.
So it was never a contract.
Who said that? Somebody, I heard somebody say it. Absolutely. Say it again, say it loud, say it proud.
Because it was never a contract.
Because it was never a contract. Of course the buyer gets it all back if prior to acceptance because of that whole absolute right of withdrawal thing. Because it was never a contract. But if it is a contract, if we have transformed from the offer to purchase to the contract to purchase, one, if the real estate office is holding it, other real estate office, it has to be transferred to the closing attorney no later than, or no more than 10 days prior to settlement. It's not no less than, it's no more than. The attorney's office only wants it 10 days or closer to settlement. Somebody tell me now. Why wouldn't the attorney's office want it sooner than that? Less liability in case it falls through, they can back out. Absolutely, just for paperwork purposes, essentially. I would probably make sure you know that. That's a pretty important point. Now, again, if the parties have formed that binding contract, unlike the due diligence fee, if the parties have formed a binding contract, then what happens to the earnest money deposit depends on when exactly that contract was formed and what exactly was agreed to with the due diligence period. Earlier, we talked about a phrase, time is of the essence, or time being of the essence. Do y'all remember that last week? Does anybody, who can tell us what that meant?
As soon as possible.
Time being of the essence meant
Things are strictly
whatever time is listed will be strictly enforced. This is the first time that the timing of the essence concept is really pretty important to your buyers and the seller. Because on the standard offer purchasing contract, it says that the due diligence period will end at 5 p.m. on blank day. It's just literally 5 p.m. blank. Time being of the essence. Which means that time period will be strictly enforced. If they cancel before 5 p.m. on the due diligence day, the buyer gets the earnest money deposit back. The seller is entitled to keep the due diligence fee, but the buyer gets the earnest money deposit back. At 4:59, if that buyer says, nope, I want out, and it's 4:59, and they do what they need to do to legally cancel, they're entitled to get their earnest money deposit back. But at 5:01, guess who gets to keep that earnest money? The seller, sure. So that time is the essence date. The due diligence date is absolutely a critical date. By contract, by default, it's 5 p.m. But time being of the essence does not mean 5 p.m. Timing of the essence means that whatever time period listed is strictly enforced. If it's at 8 p.m., it would be 8 p.m. If it's at 10, but it doesn't, it's just 5. After 5 p.m., the seller is entitled to keep both the due diligence fee and the earnest money deposit. So do y'all see how important that date is? How many of you can imagine a situation where a buyer puts down $500 in due diligence but puts $5,000 in earnest money deposit, for instance? Sure, they do that all the time because the deposit they're going to get back if they cancel during the due diligence period. I have seen, and I have been in my personal experience, where you're in the office and a buyer and a seller are arguing over repairs, and it's 4:45 on the end of the due diligence day. And on one hand, you have a notification of termination already in your hand, already signed by the buyer. And you're literally got it in one hand, about to hit scan and send on your handy dandy scanner / fax machine / emailer machine, right? And on the other hand, you're talking on the phone with the seller's agent, trying to work out the negotiation of the repairs. Why would you, and I'm not exact, why would you find yourself in that situation? Well, because at 5:01 p.m., the buyer's out their earnest money deposit. So sometime around 4:55, if there's still an issue that hasn't been resolved, the buyer might have to make some hard choices. This is one of the reasons, this is my opinion and my opinion only, but I'm right. that where are my unlicensed assistants at? Because y'all have seen this. So it is my opinion only, but all right, that you should not put on the contract 30 days from acceptance, or for the due diligence period, it shouldn't say 30 days from execution or 30 days or 25 days. It should be a date, a specific date, because it's a critically important date. And what if we put 30 days from contract execution, which is technically a legally correct term? Is it possible that a buyer and seller might misunderstand when exactly that is? When exactly it became a contract? And in fact, it's probable that at least one of the agents involved doesn't understand exactly when it shifted from an offer to purchase or contract. So please, my opinion, but do yourself a lot of favors and save yourself a lot of trouble. Put a date on there. Just put a date. Now, yes, ma'am.
So just to clear this, so when we transfer it from the offer to contract, that's when the date starts, the acceptance starts?
So that would be great. Kristen's question is, when exactly does acceptance start? Well, and it's a great question, Kristen, because we haven't gotten there yet. Kristen's question is a great example, and thank you for that, because you're thinking of why you want to put a date for the end of the due diligence period, not X number of days from when it became a contract. Because we haven't even talked yet about what exactly makes it transform from an offer to purchase to a contract to purchase. It's a great question. Now, there can be any date. You can put any date on there, and the amount of time really depends on the situation, the transaction. Is it a cash deal? Are they using special loan programs? And there's some strategy involved as well, in both length of due diligence period and amount of due diligence deposit. But once the earnest money, once we have that contract, once we've crossed that magic line that we haven't talked about, that transforms us from the offer to purchase to the contract to purchase. And once that earnest money deposit is in the trust account. So we have a contract, it's a bilateral, valid agreement. Seller's got their hot little hands on the due diligence fee, they've already spent it. The buyer has already tendered the earnest money deposit, it's in the trust account. So only a couple of things that can happen with that trust account. And this is the first kind of little twisty for folks, I think. One, it's going to get the buyer's going to see it as a credit at closing. Because didn't the buyer already pay that?
Right.
Yeah. So the buyer, if the buyer goes through the transaction, they're going to see it as a credit at closing. However, what if they don't go through? What if the buyer backs out during the due diligence process? Raise your hand if you can tell me what's supposed to happen with the earnest money deposit. It's supposed to go back to the buyer. Sure. Somebody said, great. Yeah, Ray says that earnest money is supposed to go back to the buyer if the buyer backs out during the due diligence period, right? So somebody tell me what's supposed to happen to the earnest money deposit if the buyer backs out outside the due diligence period. You're supposed to keep it. The seller's supposed to keep it. All right? Y'all got that. So raise your hand if you get that. Raise your right hand if you get that. Excellent. All right, now, here's another one for you. Keep your right hand up. If you get it, keep your right hand up. Now, if you think that you're qualified to enforce and interpret the law, raise your left hand as well. Because this will be a gesture that you will be making shortly before I get this gesture. The challenge is, even if you know what's in the contract, right? Even if you're 100% sure of what's supposed to happen, it was never your money. This is one of the ways that, in my belief, in my opinion, that real estate agents cross the line and dip their toes in the water that's a little too cold and a little too deep for them. Even though you know exactly, I mean, it says on the contract, literally in black and white, unless you printed it on weird colored paper, it's literally in black and white. Exactly what's supposed to happen, It was never your money. You were just a custodian of it. That money never belonged to either firm. It's the buyer's money until it becomes the seller's money. You're just a curator. That's an important legal concept because, and this is something that quite frankly agents trip up on. The number of times that I hear licensees arguing over a point that, in fact, enforcing that point is practicing law is amazing. Because it was never your money, even though you know exactly what's supposed to happen with it, you don't get to decide. You have to have mutual agreement of the buyer and seller to release the earnest money out of the trust account. Even if you're 100% certain of what should happen to it. Remind me, Ray, what happened? I'm going to pick on you for a second. Remind me, Ray, what happens if the buyer back is supposed to happen if the buyer backs out during the due diligence period? But everybody, great, thank you. Give her a round of applause. Yeah, would y'all agree with that? He doesn't get the due diligence, but he's supposed to get the earnest money back. If I were you, I would start adding the word supposed to and learn to over-enunciate them like me. Because, so we're 100% clear on that. The buyer, let's say that Sheila goes under contract to buy Jill's home. 5 days before the due diligence period ends, Sheila decides to back out of the contract. She should get the earnest money deposit back, yes? She should. However, pardon me for just 1 second, sorry. However, we can't enforce that, which means even though she should be entitled to get the earnest money deposit back, even though she should be entitled to get the earnest money deposit back, we have to have the seller Jill's permission to release it from the trust account. Because while we know it's written on the contract and we've explained the contracts to our client, enforcing the contract and deciding what happens with that money is practicing law in a matter for the courts. So, can you all imagine a scenario where even though Sheila backed out of the contract 5 days before the due diligence period ends, Jill's just mad and says, well, I ain't signing off on it. Can y'all imagine that? Yeah. Can you imagine a scenario where, let's say that Sheila waits until after the end of due diligence to back out. What should happen with the earnest money deposit now? It should go to the seller. Supposed to go to the seller, right? Can you imagine a scenario where Sheila says, no, wait a minute. You're telling me that even though it's in the contract that I agreed to, if I don't sign this piece of paper, you can't release it to the seller? Can you imagine a scenario where the buyer says, well, no, I'm not going to agree to release it? Unfortunately, it happens all the time. It's my belief, my opinion, that it's very, very important that you understand this well enough, not only to pass the test, but after you get your license, to be able to explain it and very, very, very clearly set the correct expectation with your buyer and seller. Even though we know by contract it says you're supposed to get that earnest money deposit, whomever's holding the trust account cannot release it without the other party's permission. I can't express to you how important that is, and quite frankly, this is going to scare you a little bit. Taking the 30 seconds it takes to explain that concept to your client could literally save somebody's life. About 8 years ago in South Charlotte, there was a broker in charge that was shot in the chest by a seller over not being able to release the earnest money. Now that broker in charge is alive today. He's no longer practicing. The bullet missed his heart, clipped his spine, he's paralyzed from the waist down. The seller was in his early 80s. The listing agent, by her own admission, didn't explain to him exactly what could happen, that they had to have the buyer's permission to release the money. Buyer wouldn't release it, buyer wouldn't release it, buyer wouldn't release it. Guy walks in the real estate office, hey, you got my earnest money deposit? Walks up to the Vic, Vic's sitting behind his desk, you got my earnest money deposit? Vic says, no, guy pulls out a 22 pistol out of his back pocket and shoots him in the chest. Thankfully, the broker in charge was standing up at the time. How could that have been avoided? By taking 30 seconds to fully explain the expectations of what's going to happen. And people, this shouldn't surprise you, people get really upset about money, especially when it could be a lot of money. If they cannot agree, yes ma'am?
Aren't you planting a seed in their head by explaining that they don't have to sign that?
Hold that thought for just 1 second, if you would. That's a great question. So Jill's question is, aren't you kind of planting a seed, right? Aren't you kind of planting, by saying to them, hey, you don't have to release it? Essentially, it's a great question. Essentially what will happen, I'm glad that you're thinking about it, what's going to happen is, if they don't mutually agree, then, if they don't mutually agree, then it goes to the clerk of court where the county is located, and the clerk of court will hold a hearing, and then if they can't mutually agree, because it's in the contract, and then if they can't decide, anybody want to guess what happens then if they can't decide? It is cheats to the state. They're going to cheat you out your money. Now, yes, it's pronounced as sheet, but I like calling it as cheat because it's easier to remember. In fact, I guess I can tell you the story. I was in a county that shall remain nameless in eastern North Carolina, east of Raleigh. And I happened to be at the courthouse for other reasons. I was serving as a witness in the case. And got to know the clerk of court pretty well. And the clerk of court said, hey, I got me one of them earnest money deposit hearings. You want to come check it out? And she was not a vivacious or bubbly or helpful person as a personality. She's maybe a little rough, you know what I mean? Y'all know what I mean? I mean, nice lady, but she's maybe 120 grit. I mean, she was a little, yeah. You could use her for taking off paint but not putting a polish on it, right? A little rough. Now, so I watched, and this is not an exaggeration. I'm not even sure that this is legal, and I'm not an attorney, but it kind of gets the point. I watched her. She says, "Oh, we get these all the time. Don't you worry. We got a way of dispensing them rather quickly." And the buyer and seller walked in. They sat down and met, and it was before the clerk. And the clerk didn't have a gavel. The clerk bangs the gavel and says, "Did y'all figure it out yet? This is the second time we've gotten together." And the seller goes, "Well, ma'am, you know what I'm saying?" And the seller's got a bunch of paperwork. She goes, "That." Literally turns in her chair. Looks at her, "Did y'all figure it out yet?" And that buyer's got a bunch more papers. She's like, "Well, ma'am," she goes, makes that little gesture, like, pinch it up, yep. And she looks up and she goes, "So y'all didn't figure it out yet, right?" And they said, "What?" And they both start arguing. She went, bang, $5,000, which cheats to the state. Ouch. Now, I do not know if that's typical at all. I'm not even sure that was legal. But it was awesome. And it addresses your question of why you got to be real clear to you're not really planting that seed, because the fact of the matter is, worst case scenario, if they refuse to do what is clearly indicated by that bilateral agreement, the other party would have to take them to court. And then not only are they going to have to release it, they're also going to have to pay that other party's court costs. But I, quite frankly, wouldn't even give them that advice. I'd say if you don't want to sign it, you need to talk to an attorney before you sign it, before you refuse to sign it. It's a great question. Now, the challenge is that due diligence fee, unlike the earnest money deposit, is pretty much going to stay with the seller. The due diligence fee, unlike that earning money deposit, essentially compensates the seller for that home being off the market while the buyer's doing all their due diligence, their informed investigation, right? How many of y'all have ever seen a house that says under contract show on the little status? Or you see a house that says pending, and you kind of wonder what that means? Usually what that means in North Carolina is that it's under contract, but the buyer's still in their due diligence period, which means they can back out for any reason or no reason. And the seller's like, "Well, I've already agreed to sell it to Dawn here, but she's in her due diligence period, so Amber, if you want to come check it out and give me a backup offer in case she backs out, we'll talk about that." That's really what that under contract show or pending is all about. If the buyer cancels for any reason, they do not get the due diligence fee back. I feel like you're going to see that more than once. the buyer cancels for any reason, they do not get the due diligence money back. Not only will you see that on the test, but more importantly, that will be an important aspect of every single transaction you're involved in. Again, the buyer has the due diligence period to complete all of their due diligence, all of their informed investigation. Yes, ma'am.
So with the due diligence, I know you're saying that you don't ever get it back, or they back out. Even if there's something wrong with the house.
It's a great question. She says, Grace says, even if there's something wrong with the house? Oh, absolutely, and that's why there's a strategic point to that. Let's say that they're in their due diligence period, they're under contract, they find out the house needs a new roof. Seller didn't have to, the seller didn't have to disclose that. The seller just puts no representation. Might the buyer want to back out at that point? Yeah, and if they back out at that point during their due diligence period, they do not get the due diligence fee back. They get the earnest money deposit back, but not the due diligence fee. In fact, per contract, and what page are we on in your guide? 234. Per contract, it lists exactly what the due diligence period is. It's the buyer's opportunity to conduct all those inspections. And it lists per contract the fact that, because I know your next question is going to be how much should it be, right? The contract says, essentially, in big, long, legalese language, this is what happens when you let lawyers write contracts. That there's no correlation between the amount of the fee and the enforceability of the period. If the seller agrees to $1, if Jill agreed to $1 due diligence fee and 30 days due diligence period, then she agreed to $1 due diligence fee for 30 days due diligence period. If she agreed to no due diligence fee, if you look right here, it says the due diligence fee, a negotiated amount, if any. Y'all do me a favor, either on your copy of the contract or in your guide, circle where it says if any. Go ahead and circle that, underline it, star it. The due diligence fee is a negotiated amount, if any. What do we mean by if any? It could be not. It's a negotiable amount, and it's. So would you all agree that says if any, it's an optional amount? Sure, I'd agree with that statement. And look, it says due diligence period. The period beginning on the effective date and extending through 5 p.m. on. Timing of the essence. Somebody remind us what's timing of the essence mean? Time period to be strictly enforced. Here's the challenge with this. People will put all the time, beginning with on the effective date and ending on blank. This is where I said, in my opinion, put a date, not days from. What the effective date is the date and time that it transformed from the offer to purchase to the contract to purchase. And we haven't quite gotten there yet, but I will tell you that when exactly it transforms from that offer to purchase to that contract to purchase is a highly misunderstood date. So don't have your due diligence period expire 25 days or 30 days or any amount of days from a starting point at which people aren't sure on. See what I'm saying? Have it be a day. Use a date so everybody knows. Yes, ma'am.
So you're saying that the deal is essentially covers what would be contingency. So if you're wanting to sell your house in order to buy the house you want to buy, you would do that during the due diligence period?
Absolutely, absolutely. And Wendy's point is so essentially that due diligence period covers things that would normally be done under contingency, such as selling your home or getting your appraisal. What happens during that due diligence period is the buyer has a ton of investigations done. That's when the buyer does their home inspections, when they get their appraisal. It could be when they sell their house if they have to. Now, you're 100% correct. Could you legally add a contingency if you wanted to? Yes. But does the standard offer to purchase a contract include a contingency? Now, there is also why it's an important strategic move for the buyer to get as many of their ducks in a row as possible before you ever go under contract. Give you an example, the next chapter we're talking about is, we're going to talk about financing. There's an important strategic advantage for the buyer to get all their financing in a row and get it all fully pre-approved before they go under contract. So one, they're not in a rush to get it done during their due diligence period. Two, so you can include with that offer a pre-approval letter. And three, so that you can make sure the buyer can actually buy the home that they're putting an offer in on. Yes, ma'am.
Will we discuss in this class how you determine how much time is needed for due diligence and how all that transpires, or is that kind of like real world lesson?
That's a great question. Alyssa's question, are we going to talk about a guide, if I may paraphrase, a guide for how long due diligence should be? It's a great question. It's an excellent topic, and no. It really is, in general, I can give you some general guidelines to go by. In general, it depends, and maybe. Does that help? Yeah, make sure to write that down. It really depends on things like what kind of financing, the situation, is it a cash deal? I've seen due diligence periods be 2 weeks, and that was plenty of time, and I've seen them be 45 days. It really is a little, we don't get into the specifics of it because it really is on a case-by-case basis, and that's a perfect example of when you should, pardon me, really have a conversation with someone in your office that's mentoring you, and it really truly is a case-by-case basis. Because outside of the due diligence period, there are literally no contingencies. So we'll take a break here in just a second, speaking of time being of the essence. But outside of the due diligence period, there are no contingencies. If the buyer backs out for any reason or no reason outside of the due diligence period, they are in breach, and the seller gets to do what? Keep the earnest money. The seller is supposed to be able to keep the earnest money. So so really, to your questions, and it's great questions, Alyssa, and great questions, Wendy. The fact of the matter is, it's really an important day. And there might be financing issues, there might be appraisal issues. But if they're a cash buyer that doesn't care about financing and doesn't even care about having an appraisal, you can get it done pretty quick. By the way, is a survey required in North Carolina? No. I said that real southern, didn't I? A survey is not required in North Carolina. Why would somebody want to get a survey? To know exactly what they're buying, right? But it's not required. And right now, in this area, the Charlotte area, surveys are running about 2 weeks behind. So if they want to get a survey, you've got to factor that in to your due diligence period. Outside the due diligence period, if the buyer backs out for any reason or no reason, they lose their earnest money deposit. It's as if you're going to see that again. Outside of the due, and again, one of the things that's a big frustration for me is when agents say, and y'all will have this agent say to you, oh, well, the real world ain't nothing like the test. Oh, nay, nay. If you think the real world is nothing like this class, then you just haven't gotten caught yet. Both on your test and in the real world, ignore the distractors, look at the situation. Say, what are they asking me and what do I know? Well, what they're asking me is, what happens outside the due diligence period? Well, the rule is, outside the due diligence period, per the contract, if the buyer backs out outside the due diligence period for any reason, they lose the earnest money. So I didn't say, but what about if they find out there's an easement going across the back of the yard? So what about, let's play, but what about, before we take a break, but what about if there's an easement going across the backyard that they didn't know about, and they don't find out about it until the day before closing because the survey didn't come back? Outside the due diligence period, couple of comments from essentially, gosh, that's a shame. Now we know how we'll be rating this video if I put it on YouTube. But what about if the buyer doesn't get what's called a flood certification done, and doesn't find out until an hour before closing that the place needs flood insurance. Outside the due diligence period, there are no contingencies. If the buyer, before that 5 p.m. date, the buyer has essentially all in control. All they're risking is their due diligence fee. After that 5 p.m. date, they are in lockdown. If they back out for any reason, they are going to lose their earnest money deposit. Now, the good news is, again, per the contract, and the term we used for this last week was sole liquidated damages. Per the contract, the only seller remedy if the buyer backs out is to keep that earnest money deposit and the due diligence fee that they were already going to keep.
Is that be mutual from the buyer's group at that point? It came to the state.
Now, that's a great question. Kristen's question is, does it have to be mutual? And that's why I keep using the word supposed to.
Okay.
If it's still, the earnest money still has to be signed off on because we can't enforce the contract. But if the either party refuses to meet the terms of that contract and release that earnest money, the other person can take them to court. But let's say that the buyer backs out the day before closing. Who should get the earnest money deposit back? The seller. But if the seller refuses to sign off on it to release it, the buyer might have to take them to court to get it. And that's where you as an agent, if you're ever in that situation, do not give them legal advice. As soon as they say, well, what if I don't sign this? All you should say is, the contract says that they deserve it. And if you have any questions about that, you should talk to an attorney. Because I can't practice law, and if you're questioning whether you should release it, you're probably going to need an attorney anyway. It really is a little bit of a sticking point. It really is a little bit of a sticking point. Now, weirdly enough, somebody remind me, what does time of the essence mean? Time of the essence. When we come back from break, we'll talk about, weirdly enough, a time period that feels like it should be times of the essence date, but it's not. But Deborah, you had a question? Yes,
I
ma'am.
do. Under the circumstances that they end up in court, have you ever seen a time where they agreed to split the earnest money? If they did not agree, who gets the earnest money in its entirety?
Oh, absolutely. And Deborah's question is a great question. Do they ever split it? Do they ever negotiate those things out? Sure they do. And sometimes they end up in arbitration to work through that so they don't have the cost of the court case. But what I want you to get absolutely.
I won't say nothing.
No, it's here. Yes, absolutely is don't play that game because you find yourself, then you get drug into court, right? And you got other stuff to do. So it really is a great point. But sometimes they do that. Okay, and quite frankly, the contract is very, very clear on it. My belief only is that these situations happen because we as agents don't take the time to fully explain. And as an instructor, I'll tell you this. Just because you make a statement doesn't mean people heard you. Fully explaining it means, in my opinion, about the time that you're like, oh dear God, do I have to say this again? They've almost got it and might remember it. Any other questions, comments, thoughts before we take a break? Yes, ma'am.
I don't know why this says on the slide, the previous slide that you did, forfeiture of the due diligence fee and the earnest money deposit are the seller's only remedies. I thought the seller was keeping the due diligence fee no matter what.
Absolutely, you're 100% correct. And Heidi's point is, why does it say forfeiture of the due diligence fee? Because the seller's going to get the due diligence fee no matter what. But if the buyer backs out outside of the due diligence period, they also get to keep the earnest money deposit. It's a little bit of a semantics issue, but you're 100% correct. And thank you for that. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? Yes, ma'am.
What if the seller breaches?
What if the seller breaches? It's a great question. If the seller breaches, then the buyer technically, it's an awesome question. And I'm sorry, your name?
Rosalind.
Rosalind. It's a great question. I should know that because it's a beautiful name and it's a good question. So Rosalind's, I should have given you a name tag. So Rosalind's question is, what if the seller breaches? If the seller breaches, technically, that's the one time that the buyer is supposed to get both the due diligence and earnest money back. Now, here's a really, so that's got a supposed to and a really important supposed to. Because when it comes to the earnest money, the seller's got to release it. And when it comes to the due diligence funds, good luck. Not only does the seller already have it, they probably spent it, right? And I ain't going to get it from them. Oh, nay, nay. That ain't my job.
Or you pursue the contract,
But the other party can take them to court, absolutely.
or that you continue with the contract.
If we're saying if the seller breaches, or the
The buyer.
buyer has the option to sue the
To
seller
keep the house, right?
to continue with the contract. We're gonna talk about that when we come back from break. All right, awesome, y'all. Give yourself a round of applause. Go ahead and take, it is 10:05. Go ahead and take a 10-minute break, and we will jump back in. And I gotta get another table. Actually, normally I would say yes.
I know, me too. I'm like, sorry. Yeah, me too.
So sorry, I'm gonna collect those. Those aren't due until tomorrow.